Thank you very much, Arian. I appreciate that very much. Thank you everyone for attending, and thank you Sepideh for hosting this. So I look forward to questions after this first hour, and as Arian said, we'll have another hour and then another half an hour for questions. So feel free during that Q&A to ask or make comments, etc. So the first thing you will notice about the book, well, the first thing might be its title, Hegelian-Lacanian Variations on Late Modernity, and it's subtitled Spectre of Madness. I probably would have chosen a slightly different title, but sometimes with editors nowadays, you sort of have to make compromises because they're very concerned with search engines, etc. So what used to be the title, subtitle, relationship is now switched. So ideally, I would have liked to call it Spectre of Madness, followed by a subtitle such as Hegel, Lacan, etc. But nowadays, you kind of have to do things a little bit the other way around. So Spectre of Madness is, in this case, the subtitle. What you will notice just by opening the book is that the book doesn't start with a capitalized first letter. It begins with the word beginning and 3 dots preceding it. And the book does not end with a final period. It ends with 3 dots as well. So it's a circular book, much like Joyce's Finnegan's Wake. The ending and the beginning kind of meet. That's the first thing that you would that you may notice. Also, what you would notice is that there are many chapters. There are 25 quote unquote chapters. I'll explain why I say quote unquote, and then an intro and a conclusion coming to 27 altogether. Now, more commonly, books will have 4, 5, 6, 7, maybe 8 chapters, usually not 27. And that's why I did not call them chapters, I called them variations. So the book kind of emulates a kind of musical format. What I will try to do in this first hour is to give an idea of what the theme is of the variation. So, you know, anyone interested in classical music will know the format of variations on a theme, like very famously Beethoven's 32 variations in C minor. So a theme is picked, and of course, there are many such variations in the history of classical music. I've adopted a similar style. I try to expound in the first 4 or 5 variations what the theme is, and then throughout the rest of the book, I keep sort of making variations on that theme. So in the introduction, what I talk about is the notion of self-reflection. So part of the introduction is to give a kind of cursory overview of the transition from Kant to Hegel, particularly as it's theorized by Zizek. So in a sense, you could say that the main sources of inspiration of the book are Hegel, Lacan, and Zizek. When I say Lacan, of course, that includes Freud very much. So these would be the 4 main sources. Of course, there'd be some agreements and disagreements here and there with them as well. But in a nutshell, the dialectical theory that I try to develop here is born out of a kind of wedding of Hegel and Lacan, principally aided a lot by Zizek. So the transition from Kant to Hegel, Kant famously held that certain what he called metaphysical questions should just not be even approached. Questions like, is there free will or determinism? Does the universe have a beginning or an end? Does matter have a kind of smallest atom, or does it keep dividing? He says if we try to tackle these questions, which he thought these are questions that go beyond the grasp of science, what we end up having are just contradictions, which he famously named the antinomies of reason. Now, this is where the Hegel steps in. Hegel agrees. He agrees that certain types of questions will lead to contradictions. But he draws from this a very different conclusion than Kant does. Kant sort of sees this as as evidence of the limitation of reason. Hegel rather sees it as evidence of the power of reason to be able to reveal the fact that being is in itself contradictory. So if trying to decipher whether we have free will or whether we are determined, we come to a contradiction, the reason for that is that the answer is contradictory insofar as we have both free will and determinism. And so this is how Hegel kind of liberates reason from the enclosure in which Kant was trying to put it in. So it isn't for Hegel, it's not reason that is inconsistent and contradictory, but being itself is inconsistent and contradictory. And in this way, Hegel joins, 2,000 years and more before his own time, the thought of Heraclitus. So, and I'll give a quick overview of the way in which alterity or otherness has been conceptualized from prior to Kant and then to Hegel. In a kind of pre-modern or pre-Kantian conception, alterity or otherness was conceived as simply two things are different. There's a diversity of things, and these don't necessarily stand in relations of opposition, etc. We have basically a juxtaposition of various elements. With Kant, what we have is an ontology of opposition. So two terms, night and day, truth and lies, etc., will gain their definition through a contrasting of each other. Each is kind of opposed to the other, and through this opposition, a certain self-determination is achieved. Hegel calls this external reflection. And beyond external reflection, Hegel wants to go to what he calls self-reflection. And this is an operation by which a given term is considered in itself. And because everything, according to Hegel, as we saw, everything is internally contradictory, not in a contradictory relation with something else, not in an opposition, but internally contradictory, this consideration of any given one thing will lead to eventually to the self-undermining of that. This is basically the root of what later became Marx's idea that capitalism will undermine itself rather than have something from the outside bring its termination. So things for Hegel undermine themselves internally. And that's the whole sort of story of the phenomenology of spirit, is that things keep undermining themselves internally, and through this self-undermining, they move to another. And it's through this self-undermining that something reaches what Hegel considers its other. So contradiction now is an essential aspect of all being. It's not just the consequence of the bad handling of concepts. Now, this process of self-undermining that leads to something evacuating itself into its other, transforming itself into its other through this self-undermining. He calls this evacuating of self into the other, he calls this kenosis. He also calls it self-reflection, also calls it sublation. He uses these various terms. So to kind of highlight it even more, the difference between self-reflection and external reflection, this is quite important, is that in external reflection, what we have highlighted is a given term's opposition to another term, while in self-reflection, what we have highlighted is a given entity's inner division. So you can kind of see why this would be very important for psychoanalysis. The point of psychoanalysis is not to remind analysand's patients of their conflicts with others, but it's to kind of remind them how their conflicts with others are just a shadow of their conflicts with themselves. And this is, in a nutshell, to put it in a kind of a psychological, psychoanalytic way, the idea of self-reflection. So according to Hegel, I quote, "Nothing in either heaven or on earth exhibits the abstract either or as it is maintained by the understanding." So things are not just either this way or that way. There's what Hegel sees as a kind of dialectical unity of opposites. So the paradox of Hegel, the paradox that he's trying to underline, is that it's only through this kenosis by which something undermines itself, and by undermining itself reaches its other. It is only through this self-undermining that a given notion, a given entity, becomes truly what it is. That's how a concept becomes what it is. It is through this self-reflection, sublation, or kenosis, which might at first feel like simply a loss, a self-undermining, that actually through this self-undermining, a huge gain comes, which is that a given concept reaches the dignity of its notion. So the paradox of self-reflection, to put it otherwise, is that true identity, like an identity in the good sense of the term, of becoming truly who you are, as Nietzsche says, how one becomes what one is, only happens when one undergoes the process of self-undermining. In a sense, one could say that a successful psychoanalytic treatment stages that long process of self-undermining, at the end of which the subject emerges not depleted, but having reached through what feels initially as a depletion, ends up reaching the dignity of its notion. So identity, to put it sort of aphoristically, is reached through the relinquishing of identity. And and that's in a sense psychoanalysis. You go in there and your identity, the rigidity of identity is constantly being undermined. Now, another term that's important here is the term diremption. This is a key term throughout my book. It's a term also coming from Hegel, which is the opposite of sublation, self-reflection, or kenosis. In diremption, what we have is the inner conflict, the inner division, I should say, of a given entity is misrecognized, misperceived as an opposition with another entity. So an identity in difference, a unity of opposites, is misperceived. What I argue throughout is that when we have a diremption, i.e. when a given identity in difference, a given dialectical unity of opposites is misrecognized, what we end up with is a very vicious kind of contradiction that leads to certain impasses. And in a sense, one of the aims of my book has been to battle, in some instances, has been to battle diremption in order to attune the mind to sublation, self-reflection, kenosis, and those types of paradoxes, because only then will a given concept reach the dignity of its notion. So a last point about this introductory variation, or the introduction of the book, is that I explained there that I combine Hegel and Lacan in a certain way. So from Hegel, I have the idea of the unity of contradictories, being is contradictory, and from Lacan, we have the notion of symbolic castration. This is very important. This is the aim of psychoanalytic treatment, is to reach, as much as is possible, what Lacan calls symbolic castration. And what I'm doing is combining these two. So what I'm saying is, to reach symbolic castration is to accept that being is inconsistent, divided. Now, when Kant, if you recall, placed a limitation on reason, even though he's placing a limitation, and castration sounds like a limitation, I believe that he is refusing castration because the limitation Kant places on reason goes hand in hand with his stubborn insistence that being itself can't be contradictory. He says, look, if you think about these metaphysical questions, you end up with all these contradictions. That means it's not our place to think it. Hegel says, what's wrong with contradictions? The world is contradictory. Even God is contradictory. It's so contradictory that it even puzzles God. In a nutshell, is Hegel's retort to Kant. So for Hegel, contradiction is in all being. However, the awareness of this contradiction, the awareness of the contradiction in being, is most acute in the human being. Entities like things don't have an awareness of the contradictoriness of themselves. According to Hegel, you have to reach what he calls infinite spirit, which is his name for the human spirit, for contradictoriness to be grasped. So the human being is most attuned to contradictoriness, and hence is most attuned to symbolic castration as well. So now we move to variation 1, which so I'm not going to go through all the variations. I'm going through roughly, I don't remember the number of them. I can quickly tell you. I go through basically 3, 6, 9, about 14 or 15 of them, just to give you a bit of an idea, which is about half of the book, more or less interspersed. Variation 1 I have called diremptive remains. Now the point is, I've set an opposition here between sublation, self-reflection, kenosis, which is accepting this process of self-undermining by which one paradoxically elevates oneself to one's veritable self by joining one's other. I've set that in opposition to diremption, which is this refusal. But at the end, these two share a certain commonality, which is that there's no such thing as a sublating process or self-reflection or a kenosis that doesn't leave behind a certain remnant. So in other words, the process of self-undermining by which you relinquish your identity in order to reach a truer identity leaves a certain remnant. Something of that previous identity remains. So I mean, to put it in a psychoanalytic way, let's say, a person who's generally has a very conflictual relationship with one of his parents or a colleague or a spouse or a child or whatever, might, through the analysis, come to the recognition that so much of this conflict is actually conflict with self. And that'll do wonders for improving the relationship with that said other person. However, it's not going to completely eliminate it. There's always going to, there'll be a remain of that. Now, that diremptive remain is not going to be as nauseous or as nefarious as what the subject began with, but something will remain. And minimal opposition will remain between the two terms. The two terms previously in stark opposition, after the process of sublation, a kind of a peace or reconciliation happens, but they're not going to drown into total sameness. This is very, very important. Sublation, kenosis, self-reflection doesn't just turn the whole world into one big soup. Hegel doesn't have this idea of the unity of all things, etc. In fact, the sublation process, by elevating a given entity to the dignity of its notion through its other, actually ends up really specifying the identity of that entity in a very clear, dignified manner. So this diremptive remain, as I've called it, is a structural necessity. The diremptive remain is an obstacle to the dialectical process because to this process of kenosis, it gets in the way, but it's an obstacle that is also paradoxically the condition for that process to happen. So what we have is at first, we have a full-fledged opposition or diremption, where we have what Lacan calls narcissistic suicidal aggression, or what Hegel calls a battle of pure prestige, or sometimes Freud refers to as the narcissism of small differences. That's the process at which where you want to annihilate something because it reminds you of your own inner division. Your inner division is entirely misperceived as some problem with the person in front of you. What happens through speculation is that this other that you might have previously hated, you realize that this other is actually my other, is your other, not just an other, not just some other entity, but another with whom you're entangled in a specular relationship, i.e. in a relationship full of projections, full of mirroring, etc. That's the realization that comes with speculation. Post-speculation, after that happens, you end up with a minimum diremptive remain. You and that other person, you don't come to the conclusion, oh, that me and the hated other were absolutely the same person. No, you slowly then come to realize what are the elements of the true opposition and what elements are just fantasies and projections. And that's what happens in what I call post-speculation. The diremptive remain comes about. So very important, we have two terms here. And now in variation 2, I talk about the triumph of what I call dialectical lower terms. Now, very important, lower is here in scare quotes because there's nothing lower or higher about any term, but viewed from the perspective of a very puerile common understanding, one may posit a hierarchy where in fact there isn't one. So the unity of terms that is achieved through sublation, speculation, kenosis, as I said, does not imply absolute sameness. There's an asymmetry, but that asymmetry that is created is not a hierarchy. However, as I said, viewed from the standpoint of a very puerile common understanding, the asymmetry might be viewed as one term being higher than the other. Now, this is where psychoanalysis comes in. In the language of psychoanalysis, what the so-called lower term actually is not a lower term, but is the symptom of the so-called higher term, meaning by symptom that it sits in the place of the truth of the higher term. So in the relation of master and slave, of course, no one is higher than the other, but from the point of view of the master, perhaps, the master is the higher term and the slave is the lower term. But in reality, the situation is that the slave sits in the position of truth or symptom of the master. The symptom impinges on the identity of the higher term. So the master at all costs wants to deny the identity and difference that he or she shares with the slave. Now, this is where the so-called higher term or the master, to use that example, has to make a decision, either resisting the identity with the lower term or accepting it. Now, fear or conceit may motivate the master to resist that identity and difference. And when that happens, when the identity and difference is dirempted or negated or denied, what ends up happening, this is sort of in the development of this little dialectical theory, is what ends up happening is that the so-called lower, is that both terms, both master and slave in this particular example, dwindle and disparage into very extreme, disparaged and farcical forms of the lower term. So the rejected term, the symptom, who is not accepted by the higher term, gets very, very angry, and the higher term becomes paradoxically in contradiction to his or her initial motivation, ends up dwindling even more viciously to a form of the lower term. So here's some examples. In the inhuman treatment of criminals, what we have in a penal system is the idea of the good, which sees itself generally and mistakenly as a higher term, and the criminal is seen as the lower term. So in the relationship between the penal system and the criminal, or the police and the criminal, etc., we have this false hierarchy of a higher term, and I say false, right, of a higher term and a lower term. Now the problem here, if the penal system, the higher term, the so-called good citizens, don't realize and don't see in the criminals a symptom of themselves, Dostoevsky famously said, if you want to understand a society, look at its criminals. It was a brilliant point, because what he's in a way saying is, look at the criminals because they sit in the place of the symptoms. They are the true mirror of that society. Now, if a given society, a judicial, penal, etc. system, does not recognize in its criminals itself, its own symptom, its own truth, and just says, oh, these are just lowly criminals ruining what would otherwise be a utopia. If they do not recognize that, they themselves, the penal system, transforms into a criminality far more criminal than the criminals that it is punishing. It is the same with a love that is purely idealizing and doesn't bother recognizing the other person. Love that ignores its symptom in hate. You know, with love, there's always complications, there's ambivalence. So if a love that tries to completely deny the ambivalences that come with love, that type of love becomes an idealizing love, which in a sense is probably more violent than ambivalence or hate itself. And again, it's the same thing with the pretense to innocence. Innocence that utterly denies its dialectical unity with guilt becomes simply the pretense of innocence. And such a pretense is even more guilty than guilt itself. So we see the so-called higher term, innocence, in rejecting its dialectical unity with guilt, becomes a guilt even more guilty than guilt itself. So quipping Bertolt Brecht, I would say, what is the guilt of lost innocence in comparison to the guilt of the conceit of innocence? Same thing with beauty. Beauty that resists its dialectical unity with ugliness is just mere kitsch. It's just something tacky. And that in itself is much more ugly than so-called genuine ugliness. And it's the same thing with the posturing of wealth. Wealth that refuses its kinship with poverty is indeed the height of all paucity. The self-satisfaction of sanity, sanity that denies its own madness, is actually more mad than any madness at all. As Blaise Pascal famously said, men are so necessarily mad that not to be mad would amount to another form of madness. Finally, it's the same with freedom. Freedom that denies its dependence, that denies that it is a freedom based on a dependence on another. That freedom falls into empty wantonness, which at the end is the height of servitude. And it's generally speaking, one could say, it's the pretense to freedom, the pretense to autonomy that seduces the so-called higher term into rejecting the imagined lower term as its symptom. Now, another important point is in this dialectic of one term and its symptom, misperceived as the higher and the lower term, what we actually have is that the so-called lower term as truth or symptom of the higher term also stands for universality, while the so-called higher term stands for particularity. And the reason for that is, very often, the so-called higher term defines itself in opposition with the lower term. And so this is the paradox of the slave, of the master rather, the impasse, I should say, is that the master wants to look at him or herself, or see him or herself as beyond the slave, as totally not slave-like, as totally autonomous from the domain of servitude, etc. But in so doing, paradoxically, the master is defining him or herself through the slave, which now is paradoxically placed in the position of the universal, in the place at which the other term, the so-called higher term, defines itself. Now, this insight has a psychoanalytic counterpart in the idea that the abject and the destitute provides the universal truth of humankind, the moment at which the trinkets of everyday life are cast aside. So the aim of psychoanalytic treatment at the end, Lacan talks about subjective destitution, is to reappropriate one's own abjection cast out through self-conceit. So, you know, in a misogynistic situation, woman would represent for man a castration that he may want to repudiate and pretend that he has no need of it, you know, etc. So in a sense, what one could say that such a man, the misogynistic man, is an ellipse that thinks it's a circle. For those who remember this bit of math, and my own math is gone very poor over the years, but ellipses have two centers circles have only one. And so the ellipse is often used by Lacan to show how, to give a sort of topological embodiment of the human being. The human being has two centers. Now, the misogynistic man is an ellipse. He has two centers, one center being man, the other being woman. But in his self-conceit, he imagines that he's a circle. So fear is always fear of the so-called dialectical lower term. And the other dialectical twist to the story, which I outline here, is that in fearing it, in fearing the lower term, so-called lower term, and in rejecting it, one ends up becoming a farcical version of that lower term. And that lower term gets infused with anger. And hence the two terms, rather than be able to create a semblance of a more peaceful rapport, end up in a relation of a battle of pure prestige, which is, another way of saying wanting to kill each other, insofar as neither term is now willing to accept its own inner division. Variation 3, I call speculative topology. There I talk a little bit about Lacan's engagements with topological figures. Lacan was very interested in surfaces, but surfaces that were kind of interesting. He talks about what he calls the Klein bottle, the Mobius strip, the torus. The Mobius strip is the one that, is of most interest for me. The Mobius strip is basically a, if you take a surface like this and you give it a kink and then you connect the two ends like that, what you end up with is actually one surface. If you don't give it a kink, what you end up with is an outer and an inner circle. But if you put a kink into it and then you do this, and then if you start drawing a line on it, you will realize that without lifting your pen, you will have a line on both surfaces. That kink makes it that you only actually paradoxically have just one surface. So it's a kind of a paradoxical type of topology, and that's what drew Lacan's interest in it. And what is interesting about these type of topological figures is because they can embody this contradictoriness in being, which was so interesting to Hegel. The problem with other forms of representation is they have a difficult time putting in one moment these contradictory aspects. So the contradiction in a given entity would be experienced temporally, where it would behave one way now and another way later. And that integration of the contradictory moments was difficult to achieve. So Lacan's, I'm arguing, he's trying to correct the problems of representational thinking by making use of a certain type of topology where the counterintuitiveness of these objects, Klein bottle, torus, Mobius strip, etc., the Mobius strip specifically, give us a kind of depiction of this contradictoriness. Now, what's very interesting is that Lacan casts his topological project as an endeavor to go beyond Kant. He says, I maintain that transcendental aesthetics, this is Kant, has to be recast in our times. He calls for a revision of Kant's transcendental aesthetics elsewhere. Interestingly, Hegel also casts his own speculative philosophy in opposition to Kant. So there's this kind of kinship between Lacan and Hegel right there, which is that they both want to overcome a certain Kantian ontology, which is really Kant's aversion to contradictoriness. So the transition from Lacan, the transition to Lacanian topology is kind of akin to what we saw earlier, the move from this ontology of juxtaposition, where all you have is just this indifferent set of things, one beside the other. Then you move to Kant's transcendental aesthetics. And then, in a way, we can say that the pre-Kantian ontology just sees a surface. That's it. There's just a surface and various things on it. Kant introduces a kind of verticality. He says, beyond the surface of phenomena, as he calls it, the things that we can know, there's this other realm, the noumena, which is transcendental and of which we can't know that much. We get little glimpses, but we generally can't know much about it. What Hegel says, Hegel returns to this flat ontology saying, no, let's not separate and create this other world of noumena, etc. There's just phenomena. But unlike the pre-Kantian ontology that just saw a flat surface, Hegel, cast in our Lacanian language, sees a surface which, like the surface of the Mobius strip, has a torsion or a kink in it. Now, this torsion or kink creates the illusion that maybe there is this transcendental other realm. And this is the thing that Hegel is resisting. So now that kink on the surface, I argue, is just another name for the symptom. So if we now go back to this idea of the misperceived higher term and lower term, what we actually now have are two terms. We can call them man, woman, parent, child, analyst, analysand. We can have truth, lie, good, evil, etc. We take any one of these so-called oppositions, and instead of creating a hierarchy, which is obviously completely fallacious, what you have is one term is represented by the surface, and the other term is the torsion, that weird glitch, that kink in the torsion, in the surface. So I'll say a quick thing about the difference between Zizek's Hegel and Badiou's Hegel. For both Zizek and Badiou appreciate Hegel very much. And particularly the way in which he moves beyond Kant on this question of contradictoriness and freeing reason and allowing it to, think beyond those impasses. The difference is for Badiou sees Hegel as entirely freeing us from Kant. He sees Hegel as anti-Kantian, as saying, don't set a limitation on reason. We can know whatever we want to know. Zizek, in a way, it's quite interesting. He sees Hegel as not going beyond Kant necessarily, or simply just abolishing Kant, but he sees him as going beyond Kant in the sense of radicalizing Kant, so that what Kant had placed as a limitation of reason is not able to know being, etc. Hegel is actually saying nobody can know being, because being is in itself so contradictory, so recalcitrant to formalization and law, that even God, in a sense, can't know it. So there's a kind of huge difference, I would say, in the conception here. So now in variation 4, I refer to it as vicious dialectical reversals. Now, I start off with a certain idea that Zizek puts forward, which I try to argue against in this variation. Zizek says that he talks about a certain thing that he calls dialectical thinking that is not yet speculative. And this is how he defines it. He says, this is the, quote, the vibrant domain of reflexive reversals in which all that is solid melts into air. This is dialectics as eternal warfare, which ultimately destroys everything it gives birth to. And a clear instantiation that he gives of this type of dialectic that abolishes everything that it gives birth to is political struggle, where sincere attempts towards emancipation risk dwindling into their opposite and reinforce an even more stringent power. For Zizek, so let's say the French Revolution leading to terror, etc. For Zizek, such reversals, where the aim was to, let's say, instantiate justice, equality, whatever, and then we get the opposite. He says that such reversals are a necessary dialectical outcome. I quote him, from the standpoint of emancipatory struggle, in the process of the actualization of a notion, the notion itself changes into its opposite, and the purer this notion is, the more brutal the reversal. Now, my problem with this is it always true that for imminent conceptual, and I'm quoting Zizek again, that for imminent conceptual reasons, a revolution's first strike has to end in a fiasco. The outcome must turn out to be the opposite of what was intended. My question again is, do we have to resign ourselves? Is that true? And must we resign ourselves to, again, I quote, the impossibility of the agents taking into account the consequences of its own act? Now, here's my argument against them, against this idea, which goes like this. Every notion is a dialectical unity of opposites. This is Hegel, and Zizek often sort of, well, not often, he entirely sees himself as the Hegel, the Hegelian of our time. So, but every notion is a dialectical unity of opposites. However, when a notion is actually actualized, like brought into the world, it loses a bit of its dialectical unity with its opposite, because it has to kind of enforce one aspect of that. Now, the further a notion is from its dialectical unity, the greater will be a subsequent shift to its opposite to correct that. So it's as though the dialectical shift that happens later, so I try to, let's say I try to instantiate equality and I end up with absolute inequality or something like that. It's that if the notion I try to instantiate is very, very pure, meaning very severed from its opposite, what ends up happening is time will, or history will have to correct that. Because the pressure, there is some sort of way in which, you know, the ruse of reason, let's say to use Hegel, wants to correct the one-sidedness of a notion. So now a notion that is severed from its opposite is no longer a notion for Hegel. It's what he calls a pure thought. It doesn't have the dignity of what he would call a notion. And such pure thoughts will lead to these vicious dialectical shifts. Now, the phenomenon of a return of the dirempted other or the rejected other of a given concept led Hegel to wonder whether, I quote Hegel here, whether beneath the superficial din and clamor of history, there is not perhaps a silent and mysterious inner process at work. Now, for this type of statement that one sees here and there in Hegel, he's been seen as like, you know, totally spiritualist and not a materialist, etc. One of the arguments of my book, and in this sense, I'm close to Zizek, is to actually argue that these ideas are very, very materialist. And in fact, I think pave the grounds for the future of materialism. But so what Zizek has in mind when he talks about these vicious dialectical reversals are pure thoughts. They're not notions. For Hegel, excessive one-sidedness disparages a notion to a pure thought. So rather than, this is what I'm trying to say, rather than testify to the lofty purity of the actors involved, a dialectical shift whereby something turns into its opposite attests quintessentially to paradox experienced externally or ideologically. So the integrity of a notion consists in its resilience in the face of the vicissitudes of fortune and history. So my contention is if something dwindles into its opposite, it means that that notion was initially not really a notion because it had not yet sublated itself through self-reflection and kenosis to meet, to first undermine itself and then to meet its other. So, and this is where my disagreement with Zizek comes about. If a notion undergoes enough of a self-reflection, kenosis, sublation to meet its other, that stabilizes the notion internally. Even if there's a bit of a diremptive remain and the sublation isn't complete, etc., all it means is that, yeah, there will be some complications in the actual historical actualization of the notion, but it won't necessarily mean that you're going to have terror and we'll have to wait a whole century before somehow magically the initial intention finally gets brought in. And the same thing could be said at a smaller scale for within an individual life. What Seneca says of real joy is also true of the notion. He says, it is a characteristic of real joy that it never ceases and never changes into its opposite. And this is where Seneca and Zizek really differ. And on this, I side with Seneca, is notional joy, let's say, if we were to call it like that, a joy that does not shun its other. What is the opposite of joy? Let's say we could call it common unhappiness, as Freud calls it, or castration, as Lacan calls it, or the depressive position, as Melanie Klein calls it. Like, the whole aim of psychoanalysis is to instantiate subjective destitution, castration, depressive position, common unhappiness. Why? So that the joy that a person eventually reaches will be a notional joy, a joy that would be impervious to these dialectical shifts. So castration, depressive position, common unhappiness, far from alienating joy, far from reducing joy, immune it to the wild dialectical vicissitudes of one-sidedness. And that's why mania is not joy, because mania is extremely depressing. It's a terrible state. And that eventually does dwindle into its opposite. There's no such thing as a person who's in a state of mania for a few months who doesn't end up in a state of melancholia or depression afterwards. So for joy not to be mania, not to dwindle into its opposite, it needs to retain its dialectical unity, at least to sufficient extent, with its common unhappiness, castration, etc. And all I'm saying is that the same thing could be asked for emancipatory struggles. If they do fail, I think it's very, very important to hold the actors and agents somewhat responsible, that the notion that they instantiated might have been a pure thought rather than a notion that had gone through this process by which an internal integration and integrity is achieved. And it is the same is true for, as I said, the end of analysis. At the end of analysis, inner division takes the place of external opposition, or what Freud called superego. So the end of analysis brings about a state of joy, let's say, but a state of joy that is entirely kept in unity with castration, etc. It doesn't end in a heightening, of the superego and a total devastation, and then only many, many, many years later does the person finally reach joy. No, the end of the analysis has to bring about what Melanie Klein called a depressive position, which sounds paradoxical. What a depressive position at the end of analysis? Well, the reason for that, depressive position, castration, common unhappiness, the names of the goals of analysis, we give it those names because those are the names of the others, the other of joy. And without the other of joy, joy does not gain immunity. It's a bit like a vaccination. If you have to give yourself the disease in order to get the antibodies against the disease. And so, you can think of analysis as a vaccination. So when in a political struggle, the opposite is reached, it means that the proper vaccination process may not have happened. Lacan says very similar things. As you know, the Hegel's idea of this inner process at work behind history. This idea is a similar idea is at work in Lacan. Lacan says what has in psychosis, he says what has been foreclosed, denied from the symbolic returns in the real. Very strange. Why would something return? Who's bringing it about, etc. How do we understand this? The way we understand it is that the self notion that a psychotic has is very one-sided. The psychotic, when in a state of florid insanity, is not capable of an integrated notion of self. This not having this integrated notion of self, the psychotic, in a sense, has a self, has a pure thought of self rather than a notion. And for that reason, there will be a greater corrective work. So psychotic hallucinations and delusions are a means of correcting the one-sidedness of the subject's self-notion. As Gérard Pommier says, in psychotic hallucination, the subject's other half comes back to him or herself from the outside. This is, of course, a very similar view that the Kleinians also have. Of what happens in psychosis. There's, of course, many, many differences between the Kleinian and the Lacanian understanding, but this part, we can kind of say they share this type of similarity, which I've cast in this Hegelian language. Insofar as the self notion is very one-sided, there will be this violent, vicious corrective work in the actual life of that person. Another related limitation to Zizek's thought is when he talks about, that we live in times where, the poison is taken out of something, or decaffeinated coffee, etc. I mean, he is very right. And I think, and more or less, I agree with this. He says we live in the times of love without the fall. True love requires the fall. I mean, he's absolutely right about it. But this is really just something I'm simply adding, is that the whole point of the Hegelian dialectic is when you sever a notion from its opposite, you end up with a vicious return later. And I think, just as a matter of emphasis, Zizek doesn't emphasize it enough. So if true love is a dialectical unity of love and falling for someone, so it's a fall and an elevation together, what happens is when you subtract that, when you just want to have, I just want the love part without the fall, what ends up happening later is the dialectic will come and have its vengeance, where you end up with a fall without the love. And this is also true even about coffee, etc. You want decaffeinated coffee. So we have decaffeinated coffee, virgin cocktails, beer without alcohol. We have all these things, but we also have the alcohol, the caffeine, etc., without the medium that makes it pleasurable. We have ADHD pills, psychiatric medications. Now we have little children having caffeine pills and things like that without the actual coffee as well. So in a dialectical sense, we could say we have both. I can now start on variation 8. We are 4 minutes before the hour break, so maybe the hour. So perhaps before I start on variation 8, we are now at 2:57. We can go till 3:27 for questions. Would you agree with that, Arian? Rather than I start.
Sure, I totally agree. If
okay.
Other and attendance also agree.
So we can start the clock on the half an hour now.
Thanks so much, Ali. I mean, I think that was an amazing presentation. Just so many ideas. I'm pretty sure that there are a lot of talks and questions here. Invite everyone to just jump in.
There's a lot in the chat box as well. Perhaps I could take a look there.
Yeah, I mean,
but if anybody wants to interject, please feel free.
Sure. Yeah, so I actually have a question. I mean, it comes to my mind while you were giving this presentation, Ali, and that was basically like about the title of the book, and also two different notions that I see in the late capitalism and late modernity. First off, I'd like to, if you have anything to, with the conceptualizations that you made at the end, if you want to elaborate a little bit about, like, we are seeing these two different aspects of, one is like really a puritan, attitude, and then the other one is a very hedonistic attitude toward the pleasure these days. I think that, if you agree about this, and how do you conceptualize this with notions around postmodernism? And maybe I also like including this, why you use late modernity rather than postmodernism in the title of the book, and if you have any.
Well, about the title of the book, unfortunately, I didn't really choose the title. I had a different title and a number of options that I suggested, and finally, as I said at the beginning, you don't get full freedom on the choice. I didn't want late modernity as part of the title at all, but I think that it enables keyword searches. Increasingly books are book titles that look more like keyword searches. In fact, one of the options I had was this long list like Hegel, Lacan, German idealism. It was like really, rather than And as I said, Spectre of Madness became the, so late modernity, that's all I can say about it. It's not something I had chosen. I wasn't particularly interested in specifying something like that. But about your other question had something to do with the contemporary, let's say, injunction to jouissance, correct? How as Zizek has said, and drawing from Lacan, seminar 20, that the superego now tells us to enjoy rather than, what allegedly the previous superego would tell us to renunciate enjoyment. That is something I touch on in the book in various sections. In fact, there are a certain number of things that I isolate in the contemporary situation, following, Zizek, other thinkers of the Ljubljana school, Lacan, as sort of endemic of our time. And of course, the injunction to jouissance is a very big part of it. The idea of jouissance cast in the sort of dialectical theory here put forward is that when a notion becomes one-sided, when it disparages to a pure thought severed from its other, when it resists kenosis, sublation, self-reflection, what happens is history or time has to correct that diremption. And this is where jouissance comes in. Jouissance and suffering come about. And this we see clinically very easily. As a clinician, I think you would agree, is subjects who have very one-sided self-notions suffer more than subjects whose self-notion is closer to a dialectical unity. Usually what we see is that suffering subjects, which are many humans, of course, exclude from their self-notion the symptomatic part. So it's a very common thing one hears in preliminary sessions is, my life is great if only my partner would stop annoying me. Or my life is wonderful if only, and there's a number of things that just seem too essential for that only. So basically they're saying, if I didn't have a symptom, I'd be really, really good. But what is a human without a symptom? It's sort of a thing, right? And so a lot of times subjects want a self-reification. And this is also perhaps an endemic of our time, the reification of self. And the motivation to present a reified image of oneself, the motivation is to elevate a notion of oneself that excludes the symptom. The symptom is the part of self that people have the hardest time integrating. The end of the analysis, as Lacan says, identification with the symptom, simply means, cast in Hegelian languages, to help the subject build a notion of self where the symptom is not excluded. And in that way, greater stability, less jouissance. So to go back to your question about jouissance, yes, I completely agree. We live in the times where jouissance is not only forbidden, but is encouraged. And and that goes hand in hand with the excessive push to the one-sidedness of notions. Those two being very related.
Yeah. Interesting. If anyone's want to just, raise your hand or just come to the panel and just ask any questions.
I have a question. Unfortunately, I'm not in a place where I can show my face. But my question has to do with this notion of actuality, which in a way would be, like in Hegel's Science of Logic, would be the place where external reflections move into internal reflections and then absolute relation. And it's from the notion of actuality that then he jumps to his political theory, the beginning of the philosophy of right, the real or the actual is rational, the actual is rational, the rational is actual. the double thoughts. I'm just curious, perhaps this is too much of a question relating to philosophy of history, but going back to Arian's point, it seems like we're at a moment where there truly is a diremption or a separation between an injunction to enjoy, a hedonism, and also an asceticism. Or if you see it in theory, in like certain forms of post-colonial theory or decolonial theory, there's a desire to claim, to have a standpoint of critique that's civilizational, that says actually the entirety of Western concepts or reason is the issue. And then on the other hand, you have a desire to totally affirm the West for whatever sort of reified, imagined thing it is. And my question is, how do we, isn't it the case in Hegel or in analysis that it's at the point where the diremption is the highest that one seeks the solution? And yet the analyst or someone like Hegel for himself or the philosopher enters that separation at a different moment, but not to fix it. It's not to give, sorry for this question becoming a comment, but there's a question in it. But it's not to fix it or to give programmatic answers, but it's to allow the analysand themselves to realize their own split, right? The way that they're driven by projections or external reflections. And likewise, historically, how do we intervene in this moment of separation when it's the separation itself at its height that produces the need for a resolution? Like what you call the hypersymptom in your book, where do we intervene there?
Yeah, it's a very, very good point. I really appreciate what you said, particularly what you said about the height of diremption. And this is exactly what Hegel says in some of his works on religion, is that he says that, you know, the opposition of religion and reason, or faith and reason, once it gets really, really, really stringent, that's the point at which maybe a person has the opportunity to realize their unity. You know, within the clinical setting, I completely agree with you. Very, very often when a person calls, makes a phone call, which is such an important moment of that eventual analysis, when they make a phone call and they reach out to an analyst, it's very often that, you know, not always, but very often in the way you've put it, I really like the way you put it, it's the moment of the highest diremption. The diremption becomes so huge that the subject just can't escape the idea that this must have some point of inner division. You sometimes see that even with paranoid psychotic subjects, is, you know, once in a while they'll say, I don't know, I've recently kind of had a thought that maybe I'm not like such a nice person. Or, you know, it's very rare in paranoia to get statements of guilt or shame about themselves, etc. But when the diremption, as you put it very well, becomes so acute, that does happen. And you know, going back to what Arian was saying and what we were saying there, the acuteness of the diremption leads to an intensification, a very morbid intensification of jouissance and suffering. And at that point, sometimes subjects feel like they have no other choice than to make an appeal to the other. And the very appeal to the other, I think, is already a step towards integration and the realization of projection. With respect to the civilizational point, I mean, you touched on so many things. I hope I can, you know, respond to some of them at least. But the question of the civilizational problem, and you spoke about renunciation and jouissance and asceticism specifically, of course, it made me think of Nietzsche. And I think that, you know, Lacan credits Freud for being the person who discovered jouissance, but I think that, you know, we can definitely go back to Nietzsche, who in a very unequivocal, very univocal, very clear way, unequivocally highlighted the idea of jouissance in the very first page of the third essay of Genealogy of Morals, where he basically argues that the ascetic ideal, that's the whole point of the essay, one of the greatest essays ever written, is that the aesthetic ideal is a form of jouissance. And, you know, in the terms of the dialectical theory I've put forward, is that you end up with these vicious contradictions consequent upon diremption. And one of them is the dialectical unity, the contradiction by which the aesthetic ideal becomes jouissance itself. And in it, following Nietzsche, one could actually say that the aesthetic ideal is the symptom of our civilization. The aesthetic ideal understood as linked to jouissance. And so we could say that we live in the time where, and something I argue in the book, that we paradoxically enjoy our inhibition. We're inhibited on the one side, and on the other hand, this inhibition is rendering loads of jouissance, something that Nietzsche was absolutely aware of. He had this incredible nostril, as he said it himself, for smelling jouissance, which is, of course, common in psychosis. The psychotic is, in a way, an expert of jouissance. Now, mixing that with his genius, he became the expert of smelling, sniffing the jouissance of Western civilization in the way it culminated at his time. And I think it's still valid today. Any other questions?
Thanks, Ali. I just want to, again, encourage for everyone, if you can, please turn on your cameras. That would just makes the session a little bit more interactive. If you can, that would be great. And if anyone wants just to jump in and ask questions.
Is there a question?
Since there's not a question, Ali, I will ask a question. This is kind of, how are you? Hi. When I read the introduction to your lecture, I mean, you mentioned a current predicament that we are all facing. And I think you call it spiritual. And I can't help but when I listen to your call for this new dialectics, it's odd because I think, as you probably know, in the late 1990s and the early aughts, you had someone such as Judith Butler and others trying to formulate an anti-foundationalist politics. And Judith Butler, in subsequent text from Gender Trouble, began to describe a almost kind of ethics that was predicated on the liberation of any domain of repressed specters. And this was what the whole notion of queer was supposed to do. And what we've noticed, unfortunately, in the past decades is that now queer has become this reified subject position, and the queer has now become this odd position that represses everything that it claims it is not, thereby reinscribing the very heteronormative operation of identity that it was meant to contest in the first place. And what we notice, or I feel what we've noticed, especially in the past few years, is this proliferation of reified subject positions that have made it impossible for a conversation to occur. And there's an actual complete and utter evacuation of empathy. And there's almost now this argument that any subject position almost forecloses the ability of another to understand another. And even within academic circles, it's almost this assumption that if one is not of a particular identity, their ability to understand any phenomenon that they might be able to claim as a biological inheritance is impossible. So, my question to you is that the exigency of this work, is this almost reinscription of a foundationalism that creates this directive dilemma that I think all of us are feeling the weight of? I mean, there are other questions, but I guess I was wondering, is that the social exigency of your dialectics?
Great question. Not in a very, very thorough manner, but I do touch upon Judith Butler's work in the book. And in a previous article written before this, I did touch on it as well. I think that I completely agree with you. It's another one of these cases where the actualization of a notion ended up with a very vicious dialectical reversal, where as you put it very well, an effort to liberate, emancipate ended up with these reified subject positions, this plethora, and I think that the failure of the actualization of the notion, I argue, and some may disagree, of course, is that I think there is a kind of a diremption at work in queer theory, perhaps, and of course it has. Judith Butler's work is tremendous, particularly her ideas on melancholy gender, refused identification, her use of Nietzsche in gender trouble, and it's obviously a very important work and has great aspects. But I think that her refusal and her opposition to Lacan and the Lacanian conceptualization of sexual difference, which is of course a debate that Zizek, Laclau, and Judith Butler had in a volume, and they've had it throughout. And so much of Butler's very, very great work is based on this relationship to psychoanalysis, where on the one hand she's quite sympathetic to Freud, makes use of Freud. I mean, she's a wonderful reader of Freud, one of the greatest, I would say. But her antipathy or her problem with Lacan is, I think, leads her to the impasse of, rather than rethinking sexual difference, because obviously sexual difference has to be rethought in a non-essentialist manner. She's absolutely right about it. But rather than do that, and this is also the problem with Derrida, whom she of course follows in this respect, is rather than rethink sexual difference in a non-essential way, they kind of abolish the notion of a sexual difference altogether. And I think that that abolishing leads to a diremption, which then leads to all the problem of the reifications that you spoke about. And I think one sees that in the contemporary discourse of transgenderism, where that is also a discourse full of diremptions, with one certain contradiction there. And again, it's in the discourse that there's this sort of contradiction where, on the one hand, the discourse presents itself as very anti-essentialist, similar to psychoanalysis, but on the other hand, there's this often this idea that nature has made an error, something needs to be corrected, the body has to be fixed in order to fit some other thing. What is that other thing? All of a sudden, it seems like we're back on a kind of essentialist idea, I think it's yet another example of a discourse which tries to instantiate a notion, but because of the certain diremptions, and I think these diremptions with respect to queer theory or transgenderism, I think have something to do, now this particularly, it is a bias of mine, but I can't help it, but has something to do with the rejection of psychoanalysis and the rejection of Hegelian dialectics. Part of the aim of my book has been to revive psychoanalysis, German idealism, of course, thanks to Zizek and with his help, and the Ljubljana School and other thinkers, to revive it precisely so that these types of questions of sexual difference, of gender, of queer theory, of transgenderism would be helped and aided by Lacanian theory, maybe even by Hegelian speculative philosophy, in order precisely to mitigate these reifications so that these vicious dialectical turns don't happen. I completely agree with you that that's exactly what happened with those discourses. Any other questions?
Thanks. Do we have any other questions, or we have another maybe 6-7 minutes? Maybe we're gonna have another just verbal question, or we're gonna go to the chat or to the Q&A.
Hi, Ali. Maybe I'll ask a quick question.
Oh, hi.
I was really interested when you were talking about how you were differentiating your position from Zizek. And I think probably because of just the format here, when you were quoting and not quoting, or when you were speaking your own voice, or when the I was used in the quote. it'd be really great if you could articulate that, because I was really interested in that, because it seemed like what you were talking about was that the difference from the notion to actuality in this, return of the repressed to the return of the real here is what is history. And you tried to articulate it within this current kind of identity politics. So I'm kind of, I think, riffing off the last two questions. I think we're really interested in what you're talking about along this thread. And so can you maybe articulate your difference from Zizek?
Yeah, absolutely.
That maybe there's a self-awareness or something that stops the pendulum swing, or the self-righteousness becoming, the tail that it swallows. Yeah, if you could articulate, that'd be really, really great. Absolutely.
Yeah, you summarized it already very well. And so, I'll just reiterate a little bit. A notion is a dialectical unity of opposites when it's in its theoretical form. It's a bit like the superposition of particles in quantum mechanics. If you don't observe them, two electrons can be in a entangled situation, and one of them can be in a superposition where its spin is both up and down at the same time. When you actually make an observation on the electron, it becomes one or the other. Now, it's an analogy. I'm not saying it's exactly the same. So, of course, with every notion in a kind of, prior to observation, meaning prior to its actualization, it is in a kind of dialectical unity of opposites. What I mean by that, and why I'm insisting on this, is that, of course, and in this sense, I agree with Zizek, when a notion gets actualized, brought into the world, something of its superposition, it gets something of its wave function collapses, to put it in the language of quantum mechanics. And so that unity of opposites is no longer as solid, and history and fortune and time will correct it. So if it's one-sided in one direction, it'll get, but what I'm saying is that if the agents are not completely innocent in the way that Zizek says, is that there's nothing you can do, the pure, the notion. No, it's even like very much something Zizek says about, let's look at Freud's return to Lacan, right? Lacan's return to Freud. When Lacan returns to Freud, he does it with a passion to bring Freud back, and he's fighting against the ego psychology of his time and post-Freudians, etc. And he manages to do that. Does Lacanian theory and the future of Lacanianism dwindle into its opposite? Do Lacanians now all become ego psychologists? No. And the reason for that is that Lacan's revolution in psychoanalysis, his revolution, had a dialectical unity with the return to Freud. Now, revolution in itself is a speculative word because it combines two opposites. On the one hand, the word means the most radical change and the most radical novelty. That's what we call a revolution. But literally, the word means going back in circles, right? And that's the whole idea of a revolution, is that it will work. Lacan's revolution didn't dwindle into some vicious, etc., because it was held in identity with the return to Freud. This is Zizek's own point. Zizek himself often says that the problem with Marx is his rejection of Hegel. And if Marx had not ridiculed Hegel's specific defense of monarchy, it would have strengthened his own position. That's why it's almost like, as a Zizekian, let's say, if I would call myself that, I am sort of debating against Zizek, is if a notion retains, not absolute unity with its opposite, which is impossible when you actualize a notion, but if it retains some of that, if it doesn't become a pure one-sided thought, then that vicious correction through history would not be necessary. And a good example of it is Lacanianism. Lacan did what he had to do, and Lacanians are still today Lacanians. We have a certain fidelity to the unconscious that we owe to Lacan's return to Freud, and that did not dwindle into the opposite, where Lacanians are all now ego psychologists or self-psychologists or any other. But yeah, thank you very much for your question. I kind of repeated sort of what you said. I hope it.
No, that was great. I just quickly follow up. Do you think the difference between your and Zizek's position is based on you being clinical and a certain optimism in the hope of the patient versus a kind of a cultural critique, or is this just a more of a philosophical difference?
Well, I hope it's a philosophical difference. I hope, rather than reducible to a personal difference between what him and I do on our as a job. But perhaps it has something. You may be right about, like, I take what you say as an interpretation of me, and you may be right about it. Maybe it is because I am a clinician, and I do have that hope that that the clinical work doesn't lead to vicious dialectical reversals. That would be awful. At the beginning of analysis, that does happen. The transference gets heated, things go back and forth, but you want to fortify and endorse the stability of a subject's self-notion. But ultimately, no, I think that there is something purely theoretical about the difference. In a sense, I see it as a bit of a contradiction in his thinking, is that usually this is the type of thing he's saying, and my argument is entirely Hegelian. And, Hegel says time is an ideological concept. Time only exists for Hegel as a way for the dialectic to correct itself, right? So, because the reason time is ideological is because it juxtaposes in time the various aspects or moments of a given concept, which actually exist simultaneously. So when Zizek says that there's this necessity to divide the moments of revolution and terror, and then eventually some reconciliation later, Zizek's idea that this is necessary is, I think, an ideological idea according to Hegel. So yeah, that's to answer the follow-up. You may be right about the specific reason for the difference, but I do still hold that I think that the difference is ultimately a theoretical one. Yeah.
So Ali, if I can ask a question, Ali, because tell me and disabuse me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that, you argue that a notion could still, it must necessarily have a derivative remain, and it can still remain a notion. So then if sublation is always and necessarily unstable, then my question to you would be, what would be the ontological status of the derivative remain? And is the derivative remain also something that must necessarily be metaleptic and always shift as you go through that process of sublation to attain the notion? Because if the derivative remain always remains the same, then you're still in the same dialectical standstill that you're trying to explode. So, I guess,
That's, yeah, you summed up the book so well. That was very, very well put. You're absolutely right. There's always a derivative remain. And that's why history will always be. If there's no derivative remain, kind of like you could almost imagine the universe freezing, because what keeps things moving is the derivative remain. The derivative remain's ontological status, to answer that question, is the ontological status of the torsion on the Mobius strip. It's just this kink, right? So it's everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It's what propels the dialectical process. The derivative remain has the exact same ontological status as the objet petit a in Lacan. It's the object A is that part of you which, in looking at yourself in the mirror, you don't see. You see everything else. You see the shape of your eyes, the shape of your ears, mouth, whatever. You see all these things. You see what you want to see, but there's something you don't see. It gets kind of hinted. Yes. There's a certain dissymmetry in yourself that you don't see. That's the objet petit a, and its ontological status is it's not a signifier, and it's a kind of, it doesn't really have being. It's a kind of scar of non-being within being. Just so like
question, can you hear me?
So Ali, I'm sorry, Ali, to continue what you just said, are we then, with the derivative remain, is that in the realm? And, again, you're the Lacanian here, so please, disabuse me if I'm wrong. Is that the realm of the algebraic X?
The algebraic X of subjectivity, you mean?
Again, it's been some time, but and especially I think the wheat interior and like how there is this X that always manifests itself differently depending on depending on the particular moment, but it's the real being an X that only becomes meaning depending on how it metaleptically appears in the symbolic.
There's something that Zizek says. He says it's like the bone, you know, it's like the spirit is a bone, something like that. It's something that resists the dialectical process. It won't let itself be sublimated, but it's precisely that maybe allows it. It's a bit like the objet petit a, Lacan says, gets negativized from the mirror image. It won't let itself in the mirror image, but it's precisely by being there and by resisting being mirrored that it allows the specular other to take shape. Maybe we take one more question and then we move on. Is that a good idea, Arian? Or what do you think?
Sure, yes. So I think that maybe one of the panelists, Shokufe, has a question.
Okay, go ahead, please.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I was just wondering, I was trying to follow your presentation.
Sorry, you cut out.
Yeah. So Shokufe, if you have your questions, please.
Sorry, there was a gentleman speaking. I don't know what happened. So
Yeah.
Shokufe, please go ahead.
Thank you. It's a very complicated discussion, and I am outside of the profession, and this field asking this question because as I read the abstract and I listened to your talks, it was very interesting to see how you use the Hegelian dialectic and to explain the process of psychosis. And you gave example of paranoia, and that as a process of this right, understood, right, the diremptive, and what happens in the relationship of the self with its own, and in that process of self-reflection, how these kind of incision happens and it separates. Is that right? The reality or the sense of the self and all the things that it felt to me that it explains very well of what happens. But then at the same time, I was thinking, how can you, because all of these theories that they have in different disciplines, aside of explaining of what's happening, it's somehow, it's a way for us to see how to change or to how to move. And as in how would you can use this Hegelian way of your Hegelian or Lacanian Hegelians to look and help, for example, or undo that kind of the rupture in the self relationship to the outside, to the other, and to itself, and to that reality that it's there.
It's a very good clinical question, and I think that Diego Aroja, if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, he made some very good points that maybe I would reiterate. Is ultimately we are just going to listen to the subject and hope that something of that diremption will over time mitigate. Even to say to hope it is maybe to say too much, but there's obviously the particular clift or the particular division of the mind in psychosis is of a particularly radical type, and it's particularly foreclosed that is the case for them. The psychotic really speaks from a position of mastery, if ever he or she speaks. Mastery meaning of a complete denial of division. And the reason for that denial is that what you and I, neurotics, experience as subjective division is felt to a psychotic sometimes, not just as a division of the mind, but as a fragmentation of the body, as a real assault that is very persecutory. So sometimes the condition for speaking for a psychotic is if they are allowed to speak from the position of the master. So if they will speak, if they are the king or the president or the leader or whatever. And so when you have a psychotic in the clinical setting, the clinical technique becomes very different. The main thing to do, obviously always to think, is first do no harm in a sense, which is allow the subject to speak from the position of mastery. Don't contest that too much, or don't contest it at all. And the way you do that, Lacan's advice is you invert the transference, you allow them to be in the position of knowledge, and you listen to their knowledge, you respect their knowledge, and you reduce yourself to the position of a secretary. He says we are secretaries of the alienated. Any other clinical approach risks becoming very persecutory. Now, you listen, you make small interventions in the way of a secretary. Maybe some of these will help mitigate the force of the projections, maybe help the imaginary in which they live to become less persecutory. Maybe the specular relations will reduce. But what you definitely don't want to deprive the subject of is their knowledge. You respect it, you listen to it, and you allow them to retain that position of mastery, and keep for yourself as clinician the very humble, modest, abject position of just a secretary. And that's the way you can assure, not assure, but the least risk of becoming a persecutory other for that person. I mean, it's a lot of what you shouldn't do that I've said, but it's kind of, one is quite limited when working with psychosis, but the one uses one's creativity, of course.
So you mean that through this the theorizing of the rupture, or of the kind of the falling apart of this dialectical relationship within the self, you can explain how it falls apart when it falls apart through this kind of Hegelian approach, but we cannot explain through that, because how to prevent it, or how to move it back into become a whole again, that unity that you talk about.
Yeah, it's very difficult. I mean, it's very difficult to convince, and one shouldn't, to convince a psychotic that the hallucination, the delusion, is a return of a foreclosed part of self. I mean, there's no point even trying that, at least not at the beginning, if ever. But yeah. So perhaps I should go to
so I think that we just be very cautious about the time as a dialectical notion. So we're gonna move on to another hour of presentation. If Ali, are you okay with going another hour of presentations? Or
yeah, I'll do another hour of presentation, and that will leave us with 22 minutes of questions. Maybe I'll try to finish it a little bit earlier or something like that. And but I think if we do 22 minutes at the end, it'll compensate for we did a bit longer. Anyway, we'll see how it goes. I think it's fine. So variation 8 is called subject and collective. There's a certain contradiction in the subject's relation to the collective. On the one side, this I quote Zizek, does not Hegel's phenomenology of spirit tell us again and again the same story of how the social substance again and again thwarts the subject's project and turns it upside down? On the other hand, however, the subject will only arise out of the ponderous edifice of language and social substance if and only if he or she agrees to partake in the collective social bond. So on the one side, you have to participate in the social bond to be a subject. And on the other side, that very participation keeps thwarting your projects, a bit in the way of the vicious dialectical reversals. So the solution, in a way, to this paradox is, the way to sort of think of this contradiction is to say that is to consider this following paradox, by which one may reduce the suffocating weight of the other who thwarts our projects by getting close to it and joining social substance. So vicious dialectical reversals that thwart the subject will give way to more reasonable fluctuations. So this is again, I don't know where Zizek would agree or not, but this is somewhere I think that the vicious dialectical reversals will give way to milder and more reasonable fluctuations if the subject does not retain a position of oppositionality with respect to the social other. And if vicious dialectical reversals occur, something of the subject's agency should be taken into account. So psychoanalysis starting point, the starting point of psychoanalysis is in a way subjectivity, which is the space where, the collectivity, I meant to say, and that's where subjectivity in a way emerges. Grave problems ensue precisely when the subject chooses the path of individualism rather than that of the emptying into the other, or kenosis. Hegel believes that fear emerges insofar as the subject flees kenosis. So for the subject who refuses this joining with the community, fear and terror and suffering comes about. Lebrun, Gérard Lebrun, Hegel, French Hegel scholar, said, I quote him, all suffering is the price that the particular pays for obstinately maintaining its difference. Lacan's other, or Hegel's world spirit, these are in a way synonymous, what Lacan calls the big other, is very much what Hegel refers to as world spirit. These are, I argue, a symptom of the subject. So to refuse to join the community, the big other, world spirit, is a rejection of the symptom. And rejecting the symptom leads to paranoia. And it's no wonder, you know, that Rousseau, who's so much of his philosophy is a rejection of world spirit, is a rejection of the big other. Let's go into the woods, etc. You know, in a very famous passage from the philosophy of right, Hegel says that doing that does not free us from world spirit, from the big other, because, and this is a turn of phrase that I really like, he says, the fragrance of world spirit will come and find you regardless of where you go. So the refusal of kenosis, of joining the social others, tantamount to a subjectivist self-assertion that paradoxically desubjectifies the subject. The refusal of kenosis is a relinquishing of responsibility. So in a nutshell, there's a spectral substance. Lacanians call it the big other. Hegel calls it world spirit. Zizek explains that, I quote, this big other emerges out of the interaction of individuals and is experienced by the individuals involved as a substantial agency which determines their lives. The psychotic diremption of this identity indifference, or the psychotic refusal to see in the other a symptom of itself, leads to a hypostatization of the other. This means that the other all of a sudden becomes reified into an actual entity. So it ceases for the psychotic, for the paranoid psychotic, the other ceases to be a virtual spectral entity recognized as his or her symptom, and it becomes instead a malevolent other. So going back to what Shukoufe was saying, that's one of the big challenges, very, very difficult to achieve with the paranoid subject, is that this big other, the CIA or the FBI or whoever it is that's trying to kill them or chase after them, etc., is very, very difficult to convince them that this conspiracy that they imagine is actually a projection of their own. The individual is faced with a huge challenge, which is to recognize that this spectral or virtual substance is his own or her own self-reflection. The irresponsible subject cannot grasp this. So I can give a kind of example of how this sort of the emergence of the big other or world spirit or however one wants to call it comes about. So imagine you have a family, a rather conservative family, and they have a daughter or a son who's homosexual, let's say, or there's something that the family can't accept about this child. And everybody at some point knows about it. Everybody knows that the daughter is homosexual or the son, but nobody really says anything. Everybody just pretends it's not. They keep, pretending that she's heterosexual or whatever. No one speaks of it, so it becomes a kind of a public secret. And so who is, so the only entity that doesn't know, in a sense, doesn't know about the homosexuality of this child is the big other. And all of this secrecy is meant simply to keep the big other from knowing. And that has huge, of course, repercussions. Living within an open secret and not having an open secret, like flat out coming out of the closet and saying, you know, that this person is homosexual and that this is their partner and they're getting married, right? Or whatever it is very, very different than everybody knowing all that, but nobody speaking about it. So this big other now, and the difference is that in one case, the big other knows, and in one case, the big other doesn't know, which sounds very funny because the big other, in a sense, doesn't exist. But despite the fact that it doesn't exist, it has effects. You know, this is the paradox of the big other. It's a non-existence that has a lot of effects. And so the big other is not some abstract universality placed above us. World spirit is not that. The big other is not that. It's something that comes about through the behavior of the agents. It's a product of the real interactions of agents. And if any autonomy in relation to the big other is to be achieved, subjects have to come to recognize that their own behavior, their own decisions determine this big other, constitutes this big other. So for instance, for the anxious young man who stays in the closet, the other is the stand-in for his own inhibition. For the parents fearing the loss of social dignity, the other is the reflection of their own shame. Both the parents and the child will have complaints to the extent to which they cannot appreciate their own involvement in the constitution of the big other. They're both creating it through their action. If the son or daughter comes out of the closet, the big other's status will totally change. The big other will all of a sudden die, let's say. But so long as he doesn't, this is what happens. I mean, that's a choice. But then the question is, should he or she continue complaining? What I'm trying to say is that the degree of suffering, madness, in cases paranoia and psychosis that a person will experience is a measure of the denial of his or her role in the constitution of the big other or of world spirit. This is the interesting thing. Every subject, in a way, is responsible for the constitution of world spirit. You know, people think, oh, world spirit is this grand thing, but you know, as taken as the big other, in all our actions and decisions, we are constituting this big other. A subject who absolutely denies any involvement in this emergence will feel persecuted by this big other. Like psychoanalysis, you know, this is very important. Hegel is interested in providing a modern secular outlook concerning intangible things. You know, Hegel talks a lot about spirit and things like that, you know, phenomenology of spirit. So it leads people to mistakenly think that he has this kind of spiritualist worldview. But actually, and here I, you know, completely agree with Zizek, who is very inspiring in this sense, is that Hegel is really a materialist, perhaps, you know, according to Zizek. Now, I don't have a particular opinion on this matter, but perhaps even more of a materialist than Marx. But certainly he was a materialist in that he was interested in providing modern secular views concerning intangible things. And one such intangible thing is the big other. This is one of the arguments of this book, and hopefully something I will expand upon in future books. This, I say, is the true meaning of materialism. To view spectral or spiritual things like the other, language, God, miracles, ghosts, to look at those in a non-spiritual way. It's not to ignore them, but it's to consider them, but in a non-spiritual way. And that's, I believe, exactly what Hegel's speculative philosophy and psychoanalysis try to do. So symbolic castration here faces the challenge of the following proposition. The essence of the spectral is the material, and conversely, the essence of the material is the spectral. Ignoring the spectral altogether, that's scientism. And resorting to spiritual explanations lead to pre-modern hypostasis or reifications of otherworldly realms. Our topology tells us that the spectre is nothing other than that torsion on the surface of the Mobius strip. The Mobius strip that I showed earlier. So now to reckon with this idea of the spectral requires fathoming and getting a good understanding of a very, very important notion in Lacanian theory, which is that of structure. If there's anything that really is so important, so great in what Lacan's contributed, is the notion of structure. Structure denotes a domain irreducible to biological inheritance as well as experience. The idea of structure I argue, is a paradoxical identity indifference of what is necessary and what is external or foreign. Now, these two concepts don't usually together. What is necessary is usually thought of something that is internal, and what is contingent is usually attributed to something that comes from the outside. But I think the notion of structure weds paradoxically these two things. And I think that's the brilliance of Lacan in this particular way that I'm trying to formulate it, is that he weds the necessary and the external. Essentialism, on the other hand, weds what is necessary with the internal. Essentialism says you are the way you are because you have some genetics, some biology, which is like that. You're this way because you are innately this way. Social constructionism brings together the contingent and the external. You are this way because of some norms that have been imposed on you, etc. And I think this is going back to what Kenneth was asking earlier and talking about the reifications that have come about through queer theory. I can now give a more precise answer. I think that queer theory and Butler, Derrida, postmodernism, many other theories diremped the particular coincidence of contraries of the necessary and the external, and lacking the notion of structure, which is actually a notion that Judith Butler is quite vehemently opposed to, lacking that paradoxical notion of structure, which combines the necessary and the external. Queer theory, insofar as it dirempts that, and of course it does many other things, and as I said, I'm quite fond of Judith Butler's work, but insofar as it dirempts that, the subsequent reifications, etc., come about. So structure rejects essentialism and social constructionism and proposes instead this paradoxical category of the necessary and external. The human being's quote unquote essence is much like lies outside of itself. This is the paradox. So if you take a donut, the torus, another one of Lacan's objects, it has the particular paradoxical feature where its center of gravity is right in the middle, meaning outside of its body. And this is what the notion of structure is highlighting for us, is that we do have a center of gravity, but it's outside of us. So a center of gravity means there is a necessity weighing upon humans, but that necessity comes from the outside. That necessity, for instance, is language. It is essential for humans to speak and be involved with language. But unlike Noam Chomsky, who puts it in the necessary and internal, Lacan dares the paradox of, yes, we are all doomed to suffer of language, but language that comes from the outside towards us. So the necessary and the foreign. So that was variation 8. Variation 11, 12, and 13, I look quickly at generational power and sexual difference. The parent-child relationship, the relationship between analysand and analyst, and the relationship between man and woman. Lacan says children are the symptoms of their parents. This is a very great statement. Parents who are able to recognize that can be good parents. So whenever your child is being naughty or crazy or whatever, and children do have a tendency to behave this way, if you recognize the things they do, they're peeing in their bed, or they're waking you up at 3 in the morning, or they're doing terribly at school, recognize this as a symptom of yourself as the parents, and you'll be a good parent simply by recognizing that. Who knows what you will have to do later about it. But parents who do not recognize that, and you know, like anybody who's done clinical work has received those types of phone calls from parents saying, I don't know, I'm normal, my husband's normal, we're perfectly great, but our kid is, you know, just totally crazy. Well, maybe there's something in the need to recognize that the so-called craziness of your child is a symptom of you, the parent. Parents who cannot accept that transform the child who was symptom into a hyper symptom, meaning a very, very angry, miserable symptom, and not just a symptom of their parents. And this gets worse and worse. And through the logic that we earlier called the logic of the triumph of the lower term, a parent who cannot accept the child as his or her own symptom is no longer a parent, but a child, an infantile person themselves. And so the parent-child relationship dwindles into a sibling kind of relationship where they're just cussing each other out and nobody can, meaning the parents can't take the mature position. And the mature position is recognizing in the other, your other, not just any other, and the child is your symptom. Now, variation 12, analyst and analysand. A clinician who resists his or her dialectical unity with the patient is not a psychoanalyst. They may be a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but to be a psychoanalyst requires that this dialectical unity with the patient is recognized, so that the psychoanalyst doesn't think of himself as a higher term and the patient as a lower term. Oh, I'm here to fix the problem that is there and I'm healthy and they're not, etc. Very, very, very important. So only a clinical approach that seriously takes the vicissitudes of transference and countertransference, which are a unified phenomenon for Lacan, can heed to the complications of this dialectical relationship. If the clinician accepts this identity, then the roles will even be reversed from their common acceptation, and it's the analyst that will actually come to occupy the so-called lower term, the term meaning the symptom, and the analysand takes up the more dignified position. So in a way, we could say, equipping Lacan, that the analyst is the symptom of the analysand. And that's the very essence of what happens in a transference neurosis. A patient comes in with a bunch of symptoms, etc. But the moment they come in and they start speaking to the analyst, over time, the analyst becomes their symptom. And it's at that point that the onus falls upon the analysand to not resist his dialectical or her dialectical unity with the analyst and accept the symptom again as his or her own symptom. Very, very important as a way of distinguishing the specific clinical approach of psychoanalysis. Sexual difference. So in today's liberalism, the dialectical relation of masculinity and femininity is entirely dirempted. And so instead we have the ontology of juxtaposition and the notion of sexual diversity replacing that of specific sexual difference. So we have now a plethora of gender positions, identities, etc. I don't know, I think it's maybe 70, 80, 100, I don't know. But so we have this kind of ontology of juxtaposition, various terms. What is not considered is that specific relation of self-reflection between the masculine and the feminine. Sexual difference, of course, has to be rethought. We can't stay with the essentialism of yesterday, but to rethink sexual difference is altogether different from abolishing sexual difference. And here, Lacan makes a very, very controversial claim, which sounds perhaps misogynistic, but it could in fact be seen as, you know, the foundation of a future feminism, perhaps. But his controversial claim is that woman is a symptom of man. And by saying woman is a symptom of man, what he's actually saying is the sexual difference is retained and the two positions are not symmetrical. If seen symmetrically, then we kind of end up with a Jungian position or a yin and yang kind of position of two sort of opposite forces that kind of intermingle. The Lacanian conception of sexual difference is not symmetrical, but there's no hierarchy. There's only a hierarchy when viewed from a misogynistic lens. You know, a misogynistic man will not recognize in woman his own symptom. He'll say, oh, she's just being irrational, or you know, any of the commonplaces of the misogynistic position. But ironically, the refusal of a woman as symptom, as the man's symptom, will make that man's position dwindle into a farcical form of femininity as well. So for a man to really elevate him or her, for a man to elevate himself to the dignity of his own notion, the acceptance of the feminine as actually symptom of himself is a absolute necessary prerequisite. So in variation 14, I kind of recap what was just said in the last three variations with the man, woman, parent, child, analyst, analysand situation. And I call variation 14 the paradox of a boundary without a limit. Because the whole idea of woman is a symptom of man, children are a symptom of their parents, analyst is a symptom of the analysand, is how do you create the proper boundary between these terms? And the answer is that boundaries imposed from above, from the outside between these two terms will be insufficient. They will not be the right type of boundary. Boundaries have to come about immanently. And, you know, Hegel makes a distinction in the science of logic between what he calls a limit or boundary and what he calls lack. The former limit or boundary is imposed externally. The other one comes about through an immanent process of self-reflection, which in the terms that I put forward here require that one term recognizes in the other its symptom, and it requires that this term accept being symptom of the other. And through this, a kind of stability can be achieved. And this is the closest that humans can get to establishing a certain rapport amongst each other. Lacan famously said there is no sexual rapport, no, meaning that you know, there's no inherent way in which humans will know how to relate to the opposite sex or relate to themselves even, but the process of self-reflection and the acceptance of the other as my symptom, rather than just, oh, it's just some other, she's just behaving this way, she's crazy, or my children are nuts, or my analyst is annoying, or whatever, but, oh, my analyst says this because of that, or my partner is behaving this way or saying that because I'm, you know, and so on and so forth. Recognizing in the other a symptom of myself will bring about a certain stable rapport between subjects, and the affective correlate to that. When that occurs and is somewhat, and the subject can integrate the symptom in his or her self-notion, the affective correlate to that achievement is shame and modesty. Here I mean shame in the French sense of pudeur, which means a certain modesty in the way a person relates to others. A person who is not willing to accept the other as a symptom of him or herself is a shameless person, someone who's just constantly blaming the rest of the world rather than considering the way in which he or she and their behavior constitute the other. Variation 15, I look at good and evil. You know, evil is a symptom of the good. You know, the good likes to perhaps pretend that it's a higher term, and by so doing, it becomes an evil even worse than the good that it attempts to suppress. We may ask, equipping Brecht again, what is more evil than the pretense to pure good? You know, and then this is, you know, a big question is whenever acts in history have been done with the idea of instantiating an absolute good that has no relation to evil, evil is strictly outside, usually those acts have been the height of, of evil, whether it's Nazism or any other, these types of heroic efforts to obliterate an evil that is strictly perceived as outside the self are usually like, usually end up being worse than the evil that they supposedly are trying to suppress. Sometimes what they're trying to suppress is not even an evil. So as Hegel says, evil resides in the gaze that sees evil. Also, the failure to recognize the formal identity of evil and good transforms the good into something very mediocre, a kind of compromise formation, a kind of simple reformation. Nietzsche was, I think, the thinker who did most to liberate the good from its separation from evil. Nietzsche was always interested in good that had the courage of evil. He said, this modernity made us ill, I'm quoting him, this indolent peace, this cowardly compromise, the whole virtuous filth of the modern yes and no. That's a type of evil evil which unwedded, sorry, that's a type of good which unwedded to evil kind of dwindles into something very tepid and unworthy of the name good. Good unwedded to the added spirituality of evil is a mere utilitarian negotiation. Jesus' summoning us to the good cannot be separated from his call to betray our kin. The only good worthy of the name is one that does not fear to tread close to the dangerous waters of evil. As Nietzsche's Zarathustra says, I quote him, "Of all evil I deem you capable, therefore I want good from you. Verily, I have often laughed at the weaklings who thought themselves good because they had no claws." So good unwedded to evil is a good without force. Truth, and if it does have force, it becomes paradoxically an evil worse, and then than the evil it's supposed to suppress. And in a nutshell, that was a huge part of the Nietzschean vocation, which was to show that no evil was as evil as as Christian morality. The pretense to Christian good was more evil than the evils they tried to suppress. Variation 16, I look at the relation between truth and lies. Truth and lies are not opposed to each other. This is something, of course, Heidegger put forward with his notion of aletheia. Aletheia in Greek means truth, and it's made up of the negates. Lethe means darkness, so it's somehow an unconcealment. So truth and lies, truth and fiction, concealment, unconcealment kind of are involved in a relationship of mutually feeding each other. Lacan also says that truth manifests itself as fiction. I quote him, "There is no truth that in passing through awareness does not lie. The truth only emerges as negated." You can make an analogy with photography. If the final picture in a photograph is what we label truth, that process has to first go through the negative that we take to the lab. It's only through that process of first being negated that truth can come about. Children's play really show us very clearly the dialectical unity of truth and fiction. Children at play are not merely engaged in senseless tomfoolery. They are serious explorers of the deepest personal truths. The diremption of this dialectical unity reduces truth to the realm of knowledge, and more specifically, it even sometimes tends to reduce it to a kind of paranoid knowledge. Truth that the rejection of the dimension of fiction, rather than lead to a more lucid vision of the world, gives rise to sometimes paranoid systems of thought. One of the problems of the paranoid person is that they can't appreciate that what they are saying is really just a metaphor. When they say, "Oh, the world is, I don't know, after me or chasing me or whatever," maybe this is a metaphor for the mother's desire or for their own ambition or something of themselves. It's a metaphor for something, but to recognize that something is a metaphor, it means to recognize and heed to the essential dimension of fiction for human beings. Scientism is a degradation of truth fiction to knowledge paranoia, arising from the vain attempt to access a pure truth untainted by fiction. This is the problem of modern American psychiatry, behaviorism, cognitive science, 19th century physiognomy, phrenology. They all hinge on this degradation of the dimension of truth fiction. The upshot of this scientific diremption is that humans' subjectivity is reduced to something akin to physical matter. Diremption leads to, the triumph of the lower term. Instead of truth fiction, we end up with constitutive lies in the guise of factual truth. And this is what are the facts? Facts, this insistence on facts goes hand in hand with this diremption. One often sees psychotic subjects having a lot of facts, but all of that blinds them even more to the possible recognition that a metaphor is here being developed rather than an objective observation. So, you know, again, quipping Brecht, one could say, what is more deceitful than the pretense to pure truth? Another possible outcome of the truth fiction diremption is the rise of what we colloquially call bullshit. Bullshit is undeniably less spiritual than lies, insofar as lies at least retain some dialectical kinship to truth. And this is sort of argued by Harry Frankfurt in a book which sadly I haven't read, I just read a little bit of it. He has this funny little statement: the liar cares about truth and attempts to hide it. The bullshitter doesn't care if what they say is true or is false. All they care about is whether or not their listener is persuaded. Variation 25. So now we're in the last two. So variation 25 is the last variation of the book. And then I'll speak a little bit about the conclusion as well. And I think that should give us questions. In variation 25, I've titled it The Symptom as Human Notion. So Hegel, Hegel is opposed to any kind of what he calls monochromatic formalism, meaning abstract principles placed from above. The inadequacy of such formalism, of such abstract principles, abstract universality is most evident at the human level, where it is very obvious. Scientific theories, as well as personal life narratives, need constant replacement. When we come to human beings, this resistance to formalism is very, very evident. The human being is that entity who most rigorously defies its definition. This is something that Pierre Magistretti and François Ansermet argue in their book on neuroscience and psychoanalysis. They say that neuroscience and genetics argue that the human being is genetically programmed to defy its genetic programming. Zizek reminds us quite correctly that the animal world is mad, wildly contingent. There are no precise laws, etc. This is something Darwin already knew. It's a false idea to think that Darwin really believed that nature is there selecting. Really what's happening is some entities are not being selected, and that looks like some are being selected, but there's no such thing as nature with any given volition. And this is something that Darwin knew. Now this nature without law, this nature without nature in a sense, is even more true for when we reach the level of human spirit, where the humans are the peak and high point of that madness. So not only were no better than the other creatures, we're more mad, more recalcitrant to formalism. And within humans, the symptom is yet the highest madness that contests most explicitly all formalism. Freud's discovery of psychoanalysis of the unconscious owes everything to the hysteric symptoms obstinate insubordination to medicine. Constantly, the symptom of the hysteric kept telling Freud that medical science has nothing here. My only way forward is to listen to every patient until I get to the particularity that is here. So for that reason, I named the symptom as the human notion, the notion of human. As any notion, the symptom is the antidote to abstract universality, the antidote to reification, and so on. The DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of American Psychiatry, represents the epitome of abstract scientific formalism. Its constant changes and revisions testify to the symptom's recalcitrance in the face of this inane or insane indexing. The symptom signals the lack of a human nature. The fall from Eden is a dialectical notion insofar as the fall is nothing but our refusal to accept the fall. The ideological error, which I christened the pre-lapsarian fallacy, is the veritable non-dialectical idea that falsely opposes the fall from grace. In a sense, the refusal to fall is the biggest fall of all. What is the fall from Eden, to quip Brecht, in comparison to the fall that is Eden? The symptom is our fall from grace, and precisely through this fall, our only paradoxical means of achieving grace. In his seminal piece on the marionette theater, Kleist's interlocutor companion admirably renders this paradox. So here I'm quoting Kleist. Oh, I'm quoting the dialogue. Grace appears most purely in that human form which either has no consciousness or an infinite consciousness. That is, in the puppet or in the god. To this, Kleist remarks, does that mean that we must eat again of the tree of knowledge in order to return to the state of innocence? His friend answers thus, of course, but that's the final chapter in the history of the world. So we have to bite again. The symptom marks the moment where grace is finally regained, but not through some ideology of a forced return, but through a second biting of the apple. Nietzsche, in Genealogy of Morals, says, everyone who has ever built anywhere a new heaven first found the power thereto in his own hell. I argue that the symptom is the inner hell from which alone a heaven may emerge. Sins, the seven sins, seven cardinal sins, the seven sins are ways of avoiding the symptom insofar as the symptom disturbs identity. Nobody likes the symptom because everyone wants an identity freed of this impingement that is the symptom. And sins are a way in which we avoid them. Sin rejects the lower term and paradoxically reduces itself by the logic of the triumph of the lower term to its lowest instance of that sin. So greed hides that wealth is the highest paucity. What is the poverty of the loss of wealth in comparison to the poverty that is wealth? I keep using Brecht here as something that Zizek sometimes does. Wrath hides the fact that power is the greatest impotence. What is the impotence of the loss of power in comparison to the impotence that is power? Vanity hides that superficial beauty is the height of ugliness. What is the ugly in opposition to beauty in comparison to the ugliness that is shallow beauty? Gluttony hides the fact that satiety is the highest form of hunger. Not to be hungry, to lack hunger is the greatest hunger of all. What is the hunger of lost satiety in comparison to the hunger that is over satiety? Envy hides the fact that to triumph is the greatest defeat of all. What is the defeat of lost triumph in comparison to the defeat that is triumph? Lust hides the fact that phallic sex is empty jouissance, truncated as it is by the orgasm. What is the renunciation of lost lust in comparison to the renunciation that is lust? Finally, sloth, the master sin par excellence, hides the fact that to not work is greater alienation than labor. What is the alienation of labor in comparison to the alienation of the refusal to work? Schelling, and this is something that Zizek quotes in his, I think it's in the Organs Without Bodies. Schelling says, man is nature's way of looking at itself, Schelling says. I add to this that this is so because the human being is endowed with a symptom. The symptom undoes repression and subjects us to the pain of self-awareness. The symptom aligns humankind once again with the task of self-reflection. The symptom is that kink in the Mobius strip which embodies the self-reflexive turn by which humanity falls from grace into the pain of self-consciousness. And yet, through a dialectical turn, the symptom is the only viable grace after the fall. Only a heightened consciousness, rather than a dive into darkness, can constitute our grace. So now I'll just move on to the conclusion, and then we can proceed to questions. The conclusion I've titled From Via Dolorosa to Gaia Scienza. So the inability to apprehend contradiction is tantamount to reducing all to the level of things. It's a form of reification, because what keeps things alive, not reified, is their inner division and contradiction. The failure to grasp the contradiction in identity leads to reification. Our self-understanding reduces us to the level of things. Now, this is true of scientific theories concerning the innate, the so-called innate predisposition to autism. These theories provide an autistic etiology of autism. They consider the autistic subject in isolation, thereby perpetuating his or her segregation rather than heed to the dynamic relationships that led to autism. Reification in science, the triumph of biologistic essentialism that seeks reification in science, in scientism, is that it's a kind of triumph of the biological or the biologistic essentialism that seeks to find a, quote, definition for the human. But fortunately, the total reification is impossible. Human subjectivity is far too stubborn for that. Topologically speaking, the torsion on the Mobius strip can never be fully ironed out. We may say that the erasure of the torsion on the surface is the torsion itself. And this makes expunging the torsion or erasing it absolutely impossible. This means that the solution is imminent to the problem. As Jameson says, I quote, "The present is already imminently the future it ought to have." The topology here put forward advocates against the rarity of Badiou's event. I advocate, to quip Freud, the utopia of everyday life. The thinness of the eyelid separates common man, what Badiou calls the so-called individual. The thinness of the eyelid separates the individual, the common man, from, and of which I don't believe there's any such a thing as a common man, separates that from the great artist. In dream, we all can make claim to creative genius. For Badiou, the subject has seen the grace of the event while the individual lives in a numb and dumb world outside of the so-called truth process. Badiou cannot see that everyone is, to quip Hegel, not only as individual, but also as subject. We all live in an evental world where language's encounter with the living gives birth to the divine madness of the human. Badiou misses the fact that the pre-evental individual does not live in happy ignorance, but that he or she lives in sickness, and that it is this very sickness itself that attests passionately to humanity. Hegel says very famously, "The sickness of the animal is the birth of spirit." All humans are subjects endowed with spirit. While some bathe in the graces afforded by art, sex, love, laughter, and music, others bear the curse of illness. However, these are essentially the same, separated by an invisible torsion on the plane. More accurately, every human is at once graced and cursed by the human. The human event is the symptom. Badiou misses the speculative tautological proposition, simple proposition. The human is the human. The universal forced choice imposed on all is that of accepting the singular symptom, that part of you, that most spiritual part of you that resists all formalism. True freedom involves the forced choice of choosing the symptom rather than maintaining self-conceit for the sake of a false freedom, which by virtue of the triumph of the lower term would dwindle to servile enslavement. So by contrast to Badiou, I argue that the only condition of philosophy, Badiou thinks art, science, love, and politics are the conditions of philosophy. I argue that the only condition of philosophy is the love of the symptom, namely the pain and sickness of the animal. Philosophy, like the symptom, is the locus of a speculative paradox. It's at once the great way of despair, to quote Hegel, the via dolorosa, and it is also, to quote Nietzsche, the gay science or the joyful wisdom. Non-psychoanalytic treatments do not grasp the wisdom of the symptom. The symptom is not an irrational oddity, blemishing the purity of an otherwise rational being. By contrast to this anti-psychoanalytic and anti-dialectical commonplace, I argue the symptom is hyper-rational. To quip Hegel, what is rational is the symptom, and conversely, that which is a symptom is rational. The hyper-rationality of the symptom becomes increasingly evident as we look at the world from the standpoint of eternity, rather than narrow conceit. The symptom viewed locally is sheer madness. You know, when you see somebody not stepping on cracks, for example, you think, oh, they must be crazy. Viewed globally, it is the height of rationality as it condenses in one intense paradoxical point the obfuscated complications of the whole. Americans' psychiatry's will to pathologize the symptom is itself symptom of its inability to consider the whole by letting the symptom speak. The symptomatic torsion on the Mobius strip is not the insignia of unreason, but rather the sign of reason's hyper-presence. To quip Freud, as voice of the intellect, the symptom does not rest until it has gained a hearing. When the symptom is ignored and left to insist incessantly, the symptom becomes the haunting specter of madness. However, when it gains a hearing, the hearing of a receptive ear, it reveals itself as birth of the absolute, namely the locally isolated bit of singular suffering that paradoxically grants a glimpse of the universal. We have not yet learned how to hear the symptom, meaning the lapsus, the slip of the tongue, the errors of the everyday life, or how to hear the dream. Today's cultural climate wavers between the irreconcilable extremes of the scientific relegation of the dream to meaningless nonsense on the one hand, and on the other, to the obscurantist elevation of the dream to oracle or divination. This is the growth of New Ageism and the renewed interest in Jung. In the first case, the dream is reduced to nothing. In the second, it is celebrated as abstract universality. Psychoanalysis opens a new path that falls prey to neither of these alternatives. Psychoanalysis provides, therefore, the model for a new spectral materialism. I can end here and we can have little extra time for questions.
Oh, that was great. Thanks. And I think that anyone again wants to jump in and start a conversation with Ali, please do. Maybe I just kind of break the ice myself first, and then we're gonna see what's gonna happen next. When you were talking about the big other, like this movement was quite interesting to me. Famously, Lacan says that big other doesn't exist. I think that in the late Lacanian, and but this needs a dialectical move. We need to accept the big other to exist. And then after the acceptance of the big other exists, then we're gonna come with the notion that the big other doesn't exist. So I think that, like, if you can comment on that, and if you see that you know, materialistic spirituality, do you think that we can understand it from this perspective?
Yes, I mean, what you said reminded me of this idea that first it has to exist to then not exist. Yeah. It reminded me of Heidegger's notion of falling prey in Being and Time. Heidegger sort of says that falling prey is sort of falling into the world of gossip and idle talk and, you know, just the silly pursuits of neurotics. And he says that it's an inevitable fact. Humans do fall prey. And in light of what you're saying, it's inevitable for humans to believe the big other exists. Simply because, though it doesn't exist, it has effects. And through time, time analysis, etc., one reduces its effect, hopefully, not necessarily, but one may reduce its effect and make it less of an existence. You know, sometimes two people who both know something and there's no one around them and they're talking about some secret, at that point that they talk about a certain shameful secret, they'll start whispering, and it's just the two of them there. Who are they trying to and sometimes that you know, for neurotics that'll be funny, you know, that they'll start laughing like, why are we you know, a psychotic might think, oh, they're whispering because they put a camera somewhere, or they have a recorder, or, you know, something like that. But the way in which a subject relates to this non-existing spectral entity tells us a lot clinically, and it's, in a way, the clinical aim is to see what can change in that relation. That relation will determine a lot of the jouissance and suffering of a subject. And you are right. It's almost like this falling prey of Heidegger. It's inevitable. It's something that Lacan says in Seminar 20. He says, the hypothesis of God, l'hypothèse Dieu, as he says, is inevitable. It will always remain. You know, that's why he has that talk called The Triumph of Religion. Humans will never, you know, get rid of this idea. And it's because we speak, and by speaking, the hypothesis of a big other comes about, and the hypothesis God comes along with it. Very similar to Heidegger's falling prey. Now, to link it to the idea of the spectral materialism is, I think that the genius of psychoanalysis and Hegel, German idealism, perhaps more generally, is that they don't shun thinking about these spectral entities. In fact, that's entirely all psychoanalysis cares about. Psychoanalysis, Hegel, all we're interested in are dreams, ghosts, big other, etc. We're not interested in facts. You know, sometimes patients might say, well, perhaps you should speak to my parents so you'll get a better perspective. Perhaps you should come to our, you know, they want to give you facts. It's like, I'm going to ask my mom if it's true that this memory I had, or, you know, so that it'll help our, I don't care about, I just care about, you know, the fiction, the delusion, the fantasy. All we care about are all these spectral entities, miracles, dreams, etc. But we want to look at them from a non-spiritualist way. Scientism just ignores them altogether. And I think that that's you know, something that I want to argue subsequently. I've argued it in a paper coming out soon. But I believe that the reason our modernity is failing to be modern, something that Agamben has written extensively about with his notion of the theological modernity. The reason that modernity can't escape the clutches of the theological is precisely not because it's preoccupied with spectral spiritual things. It's because it's not preoccupied with them, or when it is preoccupied with them, it's preoccupied in the wrong way. And this is, you know, what I'm trying to bring together under the idea of spectral materialism, which is an idea that I owe to a large extent, of course, to Derrida in his Spectres of Marx. This is what he was arguing there, is that Marx brought forward this type of materialism of the spectre. I mean, if you read Marx, his writing is full of demons and ghosts and you know, the fetishism of the object, you know, the commodity with its theological niceties. And, you know, he's like Marx is a theologian of the economic sphere, one could say. And I think that that's what makes him like Freud. Freud is a theologian of the psychological sphere. Hegel, a theologian of the philosophical concept. And I think that paradoxically, our way to a fortified modernity requires that.
Okay.
Can I ask you another question?
Yeah.
A little bit outside of the thing again, but as you just, if I understood it correctly, I feel like with this thing that you just quote that you gave from Agamben, that the problem is of the modernity is not seeing or not the way that is dealing with the spiritual, or not seeing or bringing it as the thing. And then I was thinking, maybe that's my beef with the Hegelian dialectic, is that when we turn everything, the other is the symptom of the self. At everything that we go, is the relationship. Everything there is a boundary, there is a border, and the self is the border. This self can be the reason, can be the mind, it can be also the self, the father and parents, and the person walking in the world and not seeing any relationship between the self and the thing. So, but saying it that it's all the time limiting the other as a symptom of the self, and relating to that, the big other, the small other. It's a yes. Am I wrong? Did I get you?
It's a great point. I have a response. You may.
Okay. So I'm just bringing this because I think that it creates a totality, or it tries to all the time totalize.
Yeah.
Instead of creating because I do not understand. I mean, I understood, but no, I do not really understand how encompassing or complex the term symptom that you are using it through all of this.
You understood it very well. I think your point is great. It's a point often made to Hegel, is that there's a kind of narcissistic closure in that everything that happens is just this thing that happens for me, and there's a kind of solipsistic thing. But my response, and the way I try to avoid that in what I've put forward, is with the notion of the diremptive remain. That is how the closure doesn't happen. So when I say something, the other is a symptom of the self, there is a diremptive remain where the other is not. But what I'm saying is that in order for subjects to be responsible, they have to go through the self-reflexive speculative kenosis, that process by which they accept the other as symptom of self, and then whatever remains, and plenty will remain, will be understood as truly belonging to the other. So in the version of Hegel that I've tried to bring forward here, actually, in order to salvage that kernel of otherness in the other, so that what I would argue is without that sublative self-reflective process, one never really knows, is the other another or my symptom? And there has to be that self-reflective process. So somebody may come in the first session say, oh, my bloody wife or husband, da, 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 da. And then they start describing a behavior which as a clinician, you can see that they have. So you make them see. And then you're like, well, this is you, this is you. And then at some point when the projections stop, they start seeing their partner. But what I would just say to you, there is this risk of this closure. But at the same time, I would argue, perhaps in disagreement, but I don't know, perhaps you would agree that the only way to guarantee that you are touching the other as something really that is theirs is if you've gone through this self-reflective process. Otherwise, and that's exactly what happens to a lot of people before they come to analysis, is they live in a narcissistically closed world. You know, that's what Lacan says. Narcissism is the greatest passion of the soul. Humans are narcissists, meaning they are bound and confined to their fantasy. But that doesn't mean everything is their fantasy. But if they go through the self-reflective process, greater openness to the outside will come about. But I really thank you for your question, because it's very much exactly the type of thing that this narcissism is, and closure is a kind of danger of Hegel. There is this kind of ideality of the whole as a risk, and that's what I tried to overcome that with the idea of the diremptive remain.
Can I say something else? One more thing, and that's on your. I mean, it's good. I can talk about this stuff, debate with you on that. It would be very fascinating. But on the abstract, on the evil, good and evil, and I read that, and on that chapter, just the abstract. And I got this, again, feeling that it just kind of a ring of a little bit of a risk or danger that it brought for me. And that was the setting. The first impression was that instead of going beyond good and evil, you're going underneath, you're going below it, and starting with evil as, I mean, you're taking the dichotomy away, but by taking that away, the evil is there, and then the good becomes its symptom, something like that. And I felt like it's a bit, I don't know, I found it a bit kind of, if there is a place there that, again, because when you come and saying that in the Nazism or the Holocaust, anyhow, I got this feeling of something, it's lurking there, and that's dangerous, but the way of creating that paradigm.
I think for me, and then this we probably disagree, I think, but you know, your point, I think I see where you're coming from. For me, it's very, very important to you know, not go beyond good and evil. And I used to love Nietzsche and still do, but and it's just in the same way that I don't want to go beyond sexual difference or beyond power differentials, beyond generational difference. This is very, very key in the way that I've taken up Hegel as a thinker of difference rather than diversity. And so good and evil, you know, yes, and some may say, yeah, I do kind of hypostasize them to some, you know, old morality, etc. Of course, I'm hoping that it, you know, to align it with something like the Lacanian real, but nonetheless, yes, you're absolutely right. I'm not going beyond good and evil. In fact, I don't think Nietzsche is going beyond good and evil. Ultimately, I just think he's rethinking it.
He tries, but yeah, exactly. You don't try to do that, but I saw that evil becomes the underground, the underlying.
Yes, yeah. I do think so. Yeah. That's a difference, you know, between Zizek, with whom I agree on this, and Badiou. The death drive, evil, you know, Zizek makes a point with which I agree, is that as humans, our only chance to be good is to resist our nature. We don't have a spontaneous good, really. A good person is someone who's constantly resisting their evil. I mean, this is very Freudian. Freud was a bit of a Hobbesian. You know, he's not a Rousseauian. In the noble savage, or you know, but yes, no, I do. The spontaneity, the primacy of evil. Whether I don't know if I will believe it all my life, I don't know. But for now, like when I wrote the book, yes, that is, you're right. That is something I state very explicitly. I will own that. I still sort of you know, but you know, I'm not here, I guess, to solve the problem of evil. But yeah, I do.
Very thought-provoking book and lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your questions. Yeah, this is very good.
Thanks, Shukufe. Yeah, please go ahead. Lacan.
Hi, Ali. Thanks so much. That was such a great presentation and discussion.
Thank you.
So in terms of late modernity, the one thing, like you talked about capital, about identity politics, the other big one, of course, is ecological crisis. And of course, in the humanities and social sciences now, there's a kind of scrambling to, I don't know, build like various consensus and positions on it. One of which is animals are subjects, or to think of the non-human animal or certain animals or as subjects. I think of, like, you know, the way Hegel, there's a recent book by, I think, Corin Ung or something, this idea of Hegel's world spirit should be seen as a species concept. And this, I was just thinking of, like, you know, the way I think Hegel just like had this whole thing about colonizing the Americas, is sort of bringing these people up into, you know, up to scratch in world spirit, making them more like subjects, which is kind of the broader impulse of colonization. And it seems to me like we're at the edge now where it's the non-human which is now the question of subjectivity or its possibility. Anyway, so my point is like what in late modernity, talking about Lacan and Hegel, specifically Lacan, I think, like what do they, what's the position, or what do they have to say, what do you have to say about ideas of ecological finitude and the idea of the subject and the psychoanalysis, it very much being a human thing, and whether it's actually even possible to think of it outside of that?
That's a very good question. I'll try and answer, which won't live up to your question because it's not things that I know that much about, but I do have a response, and I think the response will come more from the Hegel side than the Lacan. And one of Hegel's ambitions, you know, Hegel was not a thinker who isolated his thinking to the human domain, unlike psychoanalysis, which is entirely, and Lacan makes that even more, you know, this is strictly about the human, etc. Hegel's ambition was far, far greater than that. It's the way that Hegel was appropriated by subsequent thinkers, Marx and going forward, that reduced his thinking to the realm of so-called infinite spirit, which is the human and the social, etc. Hegel had aspirations to ontology, had aspirations about you know, understanding plants and animals and so on. Hegel really saw things far greater than that. And one of the merits of Zizek's return to Hegel is he returned to that very ambitious Hegel. And that's why one sees in Zizek's thinking things like preoccupations with quantum mechanics, for instance. Quantum mechanics is not the human realm, but Zizek is extremely interested in it because he believes that quantum mechanics corroborates the ontological speculations of Hegel. Hegel, unlike Kant, did not want to limit his thinking to any specific realm, and particularly not the human. Now, of course, in the phenomenology of spirit, that's what he's really thinking about, but the science of logic goes far beyond that. Now, with respect to the animal, etc., a commonplace that is, I think, an absurdity amongst Lacanians is to constantly deny animals things that they claim are just the prerogative of humans, language or neurosis or insanity or, you know, etc. A lot of these Lacanians making this claim all the time may know nothing about animals whatsoever. And I think that one of the things that Zizek said that kind of made me realize that is that a commonplace that is utterly false that some Lacanians say is that, oh, everything with humans is wild, contingent, deregulated, the behaviors, but whereas animals, everything is so clear, their instincts are so precise and they can follow their instincts, etc. Zizek made it clear that no, even there, you know, there's a limitation to what we can predict and how much we can understand the laws of nature, how much we can understand behaviors, etc. It's just that that particular deregulation is greater in humans, and particularly in the symptomatic aspect. Now that unfortunately is all I can say, is that in light of what you were saying, that limitation to the human is very, very true of Lacan and Lacanians, and it does lead to big general statements made by people who probably don't know much about those things. But it's not true of Hegel. And interestingly, Hegel went very far outside the realm of just considering human things. And Zizek was particularly interested in that part. Maybe not so much the question of biology and animals and so on, but very interested in the ontological questions related to quantum mechanics and so on. I know it's probably not a very satisfactory answer, but that's sort of how I've kind of wrapped my head around it. But yeah, if you have a follow-up or someone else does, please feel free.
Oh, can you listen to me?
Yeah.
So I have a question about Hegel and Lacan and the question of metaphysics. So how do you relate the question of metaphysics with the concept of Hegel and Lacan? Because I'm in very problem with this, because sometimes when nature thinks itself, the conception of Hegel and the question of Lacan, but something arrives in my mind because when it is the question of psychoanalysis, so is there any risk of reduction of philosophy in psychoanalysis? Or I think, or is there any possibility to expand philosophy with the help of psychoanalysis? So this is my question. I think it's not a real question, but you can guess and make an answer. Thank you.
Thank you. So just so I've understood your question, so let me know. Are you asking me to sort of reflect on the relationship between philosophy and psychoanalysis?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. So in this book, obviously I have no claim to say the last word on this, but in the book, the way I reflect quite a bit on that relation, and I use the thoughts that I have on the relation between philosophy and psychoanalysis mainly to argue against Alain Badiou. Alain Badiou feels that philosophy has conditions: art, science, love, and politics, and that subjects have to be graced by one of those, and then they are subjects. Otherwise, they're just individuals kind of happily living around and doing their thing. This is a very non-Lacanian view, and of course, Zizek and Badiou had a lot of disagreements on this. I tend to side with Zizek, and and it touches a bit on what Shokoufe was saying as well. It's the death drive. Every human is cursed by a death drive. And insofar as every human is cursed by a death drive, one could also say that they are blessed by it. And this is where I see the relation between psychoanalysis and philosophy, or how I argued it in the book, is that the condition of philosophy, in the way I theorize it or I put it forward, by contrast or in contradistinction to Badiou, is that I say the symptom is the only condition of philosophy. The symptom being that part of you that is resistant to abstract universality, formalism, higher principles from above, etc. That part of you is the condition of philosophy, and every human has a symptom. So every human can think and be philosophical. Every human is already deep in the thralls of being a human subject, etc. And for me, in the relationship of psychoanalysis and philosophy, the most important part is this universalizing of philosophy. And this is something that I found very strange about Badiou, a thinker who I obviously very much respect. But one thing that I found a big contradiction in his thinking is he is one of the great flag bearers of universality in a time where this idea has maybe dropped in importance. But despite this insistence on universality, he then makes a division which I find quite diremptive, which is that between the individual who has not seen the grace of the event and the subject who has. Now, perhaps there are more nuances to his view, but it is something that he repeats. I've seen him say in talks that the individual and the subject are infinitely divided. For me, they are just two sides of the same Mobius strip. At any given point, the individual can become a subject, is always a subject. If not by grace, then by curse. There's just no way about it. So that's how the relationship between philosophy and psychoanalysis played itself out, for me at least, and in this particular work.
Ali, just for the sake of time, as we have only a few minutes, if you can quickly take a look at the Q&A section, just
chat.
At the Q&A, I'm not sure if you see that part, because we had to unfortunately deactivate the chat to lower the distractions. So there is a question by Ashfaq. I'm curious as what.
Okay, sorry, I just found it. Okay. Sorry, go ahead.
So the question is that what the allergies regarding to the need to despiritualize the spectre, why it is necessary in order to imagine the big other as an absent present or present absence. Is this due to beginning from a particular point that thinks there is spiritualization and necessitates the effect being felt?
Okay, thank you very much, Ashwak. I'm not advocating a despiritualizing of the spectre. In a sense, if we take modernity as having disenchanted the world, as Weber said, I'm saying that psychoanalysis and German idealism re-enchant the world in a sense, and that re-enchantment meaning thinking about ghosts, miracles, dreams, the things that modernity had cast to the pre-modern waste bin. If we go back to Foucault saying that Descartes inaugurated the classical age by excluding the discourse of the madman, etc. Well, psychoanalysis, German idealism are very interested in the discourse of the madman, Schreber. So psychoanalysis is in a way trying to re-enchant the world, but not with the aim of going back to a pre-modern world, but paradoxically as a means of securing our modernity even more. So what I would say is the formula for the modernity to come, if we achieve it, is a spectral materialist modernity through a re-enchantment, a materialist re-enchantment rather than a superstitious re-enchantment. Perhaps, that's the thesis, let's say, of one.
There is another question by Jen that mentioned that I'm curious about whether, I'm curious whether there is a connection between the reminder you are describing and castration.
Yes, absolutely. There totally is. The remainder is the effect of castration, and hence the necessity of it. It's the remainder that allows castration to happen and resists castration and allows the dialectical process to keep going forward. So yes, it's like the objet petit a in Lacan. It exists precisely as an effect of the cut of castration. in psychosis there isn't the object A, precisely because that subtractive cut of castration hasn't occurred. Great question. Thank you.
Maybe another quick question. Just could you please clarify what you said about alienation, work, and refusal of work, please, again?
Well, I was, this was a sort of section where I was comparing I was kind of restating the 7 sins in the spectral materialist language that I'm trying to here put forward. And I was defining sin as a refusal of the symptom, I believe. And one of the things that I was saying is, let me find it so I can, you know, what I was always saying is playing with this Bertolt Brecht idea is, and this is a very Hegelian point, is the impasse of the master's position. The master doesn't want to work. The master wants only the slave to work, and he or she doesn't want to accept that the slave is his or her symptom. And so the idea is that the slave is alienated in work, but Hegel's great point in the master-slave dialectic is that ultimately the alienation of the master is even greater, because it is only through work that eventually the slave reaches some form of self-realization. And this is why I put it in this Brecht way, is that the alienation of work is one thing, but the alienation of the refusal of work is even greater. And this is exactly, it's an absolutely, no pun intended, Hegelian idea.
So I believe that we reached to 5 o'clock, which is the end of this workshop and presentation. If Sepideh wants to have your final words, or like we're just gonna say thank you for everyone to join, especially Ali, which was very, very interesting.
Thanks for all the great questions.
Thank you so much. And I guess that this recording would be available on the platform based on Sepideh's comments. So looking forward for the future talks. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.